You don't get a voice here. Get out." My father screamed it at me in front of every aunt and cousin. My name is Sadie Rourke. I'm 35. Hours earlier, my grandma had texted me at 1 a.m. "Come, they're putting me away." I flew 1,200 miles home through the night. I've spent 30 years learning how to swallow words like that. I reached into my bag, pulled out a thick, sealed envelope, and slid it across the table. He tore it open, read one page, and the man who never once let me sit down, his knees buckled. He thought I came to beg for a seat at the table. He was wrong. That single page was about to take his. To understand why, you have to go back. If your chest is already tight wondering what one page could do to a grown man, stay with me, because I'm going to show you exactly what was inside that envelope and why my grandmother spent the last clear years of her life building it. But the receipts only land if you understand the silence first. So before we go further, do me a small favor. Like this video, subscribe if these stories find you, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I like knowing who's in the room with me. Now, back to the beginning. The phone lit the ceiling before it lit me. 1 in the morning, I was still in my chef's whites, lying on top of the covers because my feet hurt too much to bother with sheets. The screen said, "Grandma." 4 words. "Come, they're putting me away." I read it 3 times. My thumb hovered over the call button, and I made myself stop, because if I called her at that hour and a man answered, I would lose the only move I had. So instead, I sat up in the dark and listened to my own pulse in my ears, and the kitchen behind my apartment door still smelled like the night's last service, garlic and scorched butter, and none of it felt real. I want to tell you I leapt into action. I didn't. For a long minute, I just held the phone against my sternum like it could keep something from getting out. Then I got up and packed. I didn't pack much. A toothbrush, 2 shirts. And from the back of my closet, behind the winter coats I never wear in the South, a thick, padded envelope a lawyer's office had mailed me the summer before. It had come with one line of my grandmother's handwriting on a sticky note pressed to the front. "Don't open it until they make their move." I'd kept it in a drawer for months. I'd picked it up exactly twice, turned it over, set it back down. She'd told me on the phone, in that light voice she used when she was deciding something heavy. "Just keep it safe. You'll know when." I'd stopped asking. With her, you learned that the more she waved a thing off, the more it mattered. I put the envelope in my bag on top of the 2 shirts, and I told myself I still wasn't going to open it. Here is what I was leaving behind. A small restaurant with my name on the lease and 22 seats and a line cook who called me chef and meant it. I had built a place 1,200 miles from that family where people were glad when I walked in the door. I had spent my adult life building exactly that, a room where my presence wasn't a question. And at 1 in the morning, I locked it and walked away from it without knowing for how long. Because of 4 words from the only person who'd ever made me feel that way before I learned to make it for myself. I hadn't set foot in that house in years. The last time, there'd been a cousin's wedding and a printed seating chart, and my name was not on it, not at any table. Just an oversight everyone agreed was an oversight while I stood in the foyer holding a gift. My grandmother had found me out there and tried to make room at her own table, and I had told her no. It was fine. I'd catch a flight back that night, and I had, and somewhere over the runway, I'd quietly decided I was done going back. I kept that promise for a long time. It took her 4 words at 1 in the morning to break it. The first flight out left a little after dawn. I texted my sous chef from the gate, "Family emergency. Cover for me. I don't know how long." He wrote back, "Go. We've got it." Then he sent a second text, just, "You okay?" And I didn't answer because I didn't have a true answer, and he'd know if I lied. The man at the window seat slept the whole way. I scrolled back through my texts with my grandmother while the country went gray to gold under the wing. Months of them. A photo of the gardenia in bloom. A recipe she swore by, then a correction an hour later, because she'd left out the salt on purpose to test me. Then, in the last few months, the messages getting shorter. Sparser. One that just said, "Don't worry about me." I had not worried enough about a woman who told me not to worry. I knew that already, at 30,000 feet, before I knew the half of it. To know why I flew toward a house that had spent my whole life keeping me at its edge, you have to know what that edge was made of, and who built me a chair there anyway. So, let me take you all the way back, to a kitchen that smelled like gardenias and butter, and the only person who ever pulled one out for me. Her hands were always the first thing. My grandmother, Opal Faircloth, cooked the way other people pray, with her whole body leaning into it, and when I was small, she would stand behind me at the stove and put her hands over mine on the spoon. The screen door was always cracked, and the gardenia bush right outside it pushed its smell into the kitchen until the whole room was thick and sweet with it. I can still close my eyes and be 8 years old in that light. "Taste it before you trust it," she'd say, and lift the spoon to my mouth. Recipes lie, your tongue doesn't. I came into that house the way a lot of children come into families like that, sideways. My mother, Maribel, married my father when I was 5 or 6, and she brought me with her like a second suitcase nobody had agreed to carry. He had a name that went back generations in that part of Georgia, the kind of name carved into a pew and a bank. We did not. To his people, I was the wife's girl, the extra, the one whose place at any gathering was a question to be settled, rather than a fact. There was a portrait on the stairs. Every couple of years, the whole family would crowd onto the back porch in their good clothes, and a photographer would come, and the new print would go up on the stair wall in a heavy frame, the Faircloths through time, marching up toward the landing. I am not in a single one of those frames. The one year someone thought to wave me in, I ended up at the very back, half behind my cousin Wade's shoulder, and when the print was framed, the edge cut me off at the arm. For years, I walked up those stairs, past a wall of a family I lived inside of and did not appear in. But Opal looked at me across that first crowded dinner table, saw me hovering at the edge of it, and got up and dragged a chair over and wedged it in next to her own. "There," she said, like she was correcting a clerical error. "Now, everyone's accounted for." She did that for years. At every holiday, when the seating became a quiet negotiation nobody included me in, there was a chair beside hers that she had already pulled out. One Thanksgiving, an aunt counted the table out loud, counting chairs against names, and landed on me with a little pause, the math not working. And my grandmother said, without looking up from the gravy, "She sits with me. She always sits with me." And that was the end of the counting. When I was 16, an aunt told me at a christening that I shouldn't expect to be in the family pictures, that it wouldn't be right, not being blood. My grandmother heard it from across the room. She crossed the whole churchyard, took the camera right out of the photographer's hands, and said, "Then we won't have any pictures today." And we didn't. The aunt never forgave her. My grandmother never once mentioned it again, to me or to anyone. She just did it and let it stand, the way she did all the things that mattered. I learned to cook in that kitchen because cooking was the one way I could earn a place at a table that hadn't been set for me. If I made the food, I had a reason to be there. I was useful. Useful was close enough to belonging that I could pretend for whole evenings that they were the same thing. I asked her once, when I was 9 and old enough to have heard the whispers, why I didn't have the right last name like the cousins. She wiped her hands on her apron and crouched down so we were eye to eye, and she said it plain, the way you'd tell a child the stove was hot. "Blood didn't make you mine," she said. I did. I held on to that sentence, the way you hold a coin in a pocket with a hole in it, checking, always checking, that it hadn't fallen out. It nearly did when I was 14. My mother died that spring. I won't make you sit in the hospital with me. Some doors you close. But I'll tell you about the day after the funeral, because that's the day I learned the shape of my own future. The house was full of people in dark clothes balancing little plates. I was standing by the mantel where a photograph of my mother used to be, except it wasn't there anymore, and I was staring at the clean rectangle on the wall where the sun hadn't faded it, when a great-aunt came up beside me with her plate and her sympathy face. She squeezed my shoulder. "You'll be all right, sweetheart," she said. "You're young, and you're not really one of us, so it's not quite the same for you, is it?" She meant it kindly. That's the part that took me years to understand. She wasn't being cruel. She was just stating, out loud, the family arithmetic that everyone agreed on and no one ever said in front of me, until that day, when grief made everyone honest. I was 14. I learned to disappear. Here's the part that mattered most, the part my father's family never grasped, because it never occurred to them to check the paperwork. He never adopted me. Not when he married my mother, not after she died, and I kept living under his roof eating his food. Not ever. On paper, legally, I belonged to no one in that house. I was not his daughter. I was not Opal's grandchild. There was no document anywhere in the state of Georgia that made me family. For 30 years, I treated that fact like a thing to apologize for. I made myself small. I made myself useful. I cooked every holiday meal that family ever ate, and I carried the platters out, and I ate standing up in the kitchen. And when someone said something with a hook in it, I smiled and let it pass, because keeping the peace was cheaper than being right, and I had decided, somewhere around 14, that peace was worth more than my place. What I didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the one person who'd ever pulled out a chair for me had kept something else, too. Years later, I found out that the photograph of my mother that vanished off the mantel after the funeral hadn't been thrown away. My grandmother had quietly taken it down before my father could, and tucked it into the back of a kitchen drawer, behind the dish towels, where she could see it when she reached for them. "Your mother belongs in this house," she told me once, slipping it half out so I could look. "So do you." She kept what they erased. I just didn't understand yet how far she was willing to go to prove it. It started with the calls getting quieter. For most of my adult life, my grandmother called me on Sunday evenings and talked for an hour about nothing, the neighbor's roses, a recipe she'd ruined on purpose to see if I'd catch it. Her voice filled the line. Then, over the last year or so, it started to thin out. The calls got shorter. She'd lower her voice in the middle of a sentence like someone had walked into the room. One Sunday, I heard a man's voice in the background, low, and she said, "I have to go, sweet girl," in the middle of a story about the gardenia, and the line went dead before I could answer. I called back twice. It rang and rang. Another Sunday, she said, almost as an aside, "Your father handles everything now. The bills, the bank, all of it. He has power of attorney." I didn't like the word. I sat up straighter on my couch and asked her, careful, what that meant for her day to day. She laughed it off. "It's easier not to fight him," she said. "You know how he gets." I tried to do something. I want you to know I tried, even if I did it 1,200 miles away and far too gently. I called the bank and asked a question about my grandmother's accounts, and the woman on the line asked me, politely, "And what is your relationship to the account holder, ma'am?" And I opened my mouth, and there was nothing in it. Granddaughter wasn't true on paper. Daughter wasn't true on paper. I said family friend, and she said she couldn't discuss anything, and she was right. And I hung up and sat there with the oldest fact of my life pressed against my teeth. I had no standing. I had never had any standing. The family had spent 30 years making sure of it, and now, when it mattered, the paperwork agreed with them. I called a county office once, an aging services line I found online, and a kind, tired man asked me the same question in different words. Was I a relative? Did I have any legal authority to act? No. He gave me a number for Adult Protective Services and told me anyone could make a report, family or not. And I wrote it down and stared at it and didn't call it, because I told myself I didn't have enough, and because some animal part of me, the 14-year-old at the mantel, still believed it wasn't my place. That number sat on a sticky note on my refrigerator for weeks. I am not proud of how long it sat there. There was one call in there I still hear. Late, her voice thick and slow, the words coming apart. I'm just so tired, sweet girl. They give me something to help me sleep. And a man's voice somewhere behind her saying it was time to hang up. I sat with my coat already half on. I'd looked up flights twice that month. I got as far as the confirmation screen once, my thumb over the button. And then I thought about walking into that house uninvited, about the ants, about the seating charts of my whole life, about being told at the door that this was family business and not mine, and I closed the screen. I told myself I'd go when I had a reason they couldn't turn away. I was waiting for permission to save the person who was trying to save me. Then, in the early summer, the padded envelope came. It arrived from a law office in Savannah I'd never heard of, but the return address had her name under the firm's, and her handwriting was on that sticky note on the front. Don't open it until they make their move. I called her the second I had it in my hands. Grandma, what is this? What's in it? Something I've made sure of, she said. There was a steadiness under her voice that I hadn't heard in months, like bedrock under floodwater. I've made sure you're protected. Just keep it safe. Protected from what? A pause. Then lighter, deflecting, the way she always did when she decided not to scare me with the size of a thing. You'll know when. Don't open it before then. Promise me. I promised. Because she asked. Because some part of me, the 8-year-old with her hand under Opal's hand on the spoon, would have promised her anything. So a frightened-sounding old woman had her own lawyer and a sealed envelope and a calm I couldn't account for. And I noticed none of it, because I had spent 3 decades training myself not to look directly at that family. I knew, vaguely, that a date was coming, that my father wanted everyone home to settle some things about mother's care. And I heard it secondhand from a cousin, the way I heard everything. And then it was 1 a.m, and the phone lit the ceiling, and the 4 words came, and there was no more telling myself anything at all. That text wasn't a cry for help. I understand that now. It was a starting gun. The gardenia was the first thing I saw. And it was dying. The plane had landed near noon, and a rideshare took me down streets I knew in my body even after years away. The live oaks dripping moss, the heat coming up off the brick. When I came up the walk, the bush by the kitchen door, the one that had perfumed my whole childhood, was brown at the edges and folding in on itself, the way a thing does when no one's been watering it and no one's noticed. Inside, the house was cold. Not cool. Cold, like the thermostat had been set by someone who didn't have to live in it. A stack of mail leaned on the hall table, unopened, some of it with the red lettering bills get when nobody's paying them. I found my grandmother in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of the mattress with a suitcase open beside her. She was folding a cardigan with hands that wouldn't stay still, and she'd folded the same cardigan, I could tell, several times, smoothing it and unfolding it and starting again. I had to set my bag down in the doorway and put my hand flat against the frame. She looked up, 84 years old, and she'd gotten so small. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Grandma, what's happening?" "They want me out by Monday." She said it to the cardigan, not to me. "There's a place. Garrett picked it. He says it's lovely." Her mouth did something I won't try to name. "He says it's the kind thing to do." I crossed the room and knelt down in front of her and put my hands over hers to stop them moving, the way she used to do for me at the stove. And they were ice cold, and that's all I'll say about that. "How did you text me?" I asked her. "He has your phone." A flicker of the old mischief crossed her face. She reached under the mattress and showed me, just for a second, a cheap little prepaid phone, the kind you buy at a drugstore. "Etta brought it to me," she said. "He took my real one months ago. Says I call too many people and confuse myself." She tucked it back. "I keep this one for emergencies. And for you." Etta? Of course it was Etta. The woman had been quietly keeping that house, and me, alive my entire life. I looked around the room while she tucked the little phone away, and I made myself see it. All of it. The water glass on her nightstand had a ring of dust at the bottom. There was a pill organizer with half its little doors still full from days before, days nobody had helped her sort. The radiator was cold to the touch. Her good coat hung in the open closet, and beside the bed, the suitcase sat open, that one cardigan folded and refolded on top, as if packing slowly enough could keep Monday from coming. "What is the place?" I asked her. "The one he picked." He left the brochure on my bed. She said it the way you'd report the weather. Smiling old people on a green lawn. Marsh something. I called the number on this phone when he was out. A girl told me visiting hours and what I could bring. Her hands found each other in her lap. 2 bags. She said I could bring 2 bags. 84 years of a life. 2 bags. And the house? "Sold by Monday," he says, "to pay for my care." Her mouth did the thing again, the thing I won't try to name. He's very worried about my care. "When did you last talk to anyone?" I asked. "Your card friends, the neighbors, anyone." He told them I wasn't up to visitors. She looked at the cold radiator. After a while, they stopped trying. It's easier for everyone, I suppose, when the troublesome one goes quiet. She squeezed my fingers once. "You'd know about that." I would. We were the same kind of quiet, she and I, both of us schooled in it by the same people. I didn't trust my voice for that one, so I just held her cold hands a moment longer and listened to the cold house tick around us. When I stood up to get her some water, I heard footsteps in the hall and turned. And there was my aunt, my father's sister, blocking the bedroom doorway with her arms folded. "Sadie." She said my name like a closed door. "We weren't expecting you. Grandma asked me to come. This is family business," she said, "not yours." There it was, the oldest sentence in that house, the one I'd been raised on. Not yours. I'd swallowed it 1,000 times. I felt the old reflex rise, the smile, the step back, the let it pass. I held her eyes and didn't step back, but I didn't fight her either. Not yet, because there was a clock running in that house, and I needed to understand it before I touched anything. She let it go and went off down the hall, heels hard on the wood. And behind me, my grandmother said quietly, "The clock in the hall. Listen to it a minute. It's older than your father." A breath. Keeps better time than he does. I sat with her and we listened to it. The big pendulum clock in the front hall, ticking the way it had ticked through every dinner of my childhood, steady, indifferent, counting. Somewhere out there, a Monday was coming for her. And the clock didn't care. And neither did the man who'd set the date. I had a few hours before the rest of them arrived. So, it turned out, did he. The china cabinet told me before anyone said a word. I went looking for a clean glass and found myself in the dining room in front of the tall, glass-fronted cabinet that had always held the family silver, and, on its middle shelf, a heavy brass mantel clock that had belonged to my grandmother's mother. The clock was gone. So was most of the silver. Where the clock had stood, there was a clean shape in the dust, an outline like the rectangle on the mantel where my mother's photograph used to be. This house kept leaving me those clean rectangles where something loved had been removed. Etta was in the kitchen. Etta had kept that house for as long as I'd been alive, and she'd always slipped me a plate when I was a kid, eating standing up. I asked her, light as I could, where the brass clock had gone. She didn't look at me. "Mr. Garrett took it to be appraised," she said, wiping a counter that was already clean. Then, before she could stop herself, "Months ago. Appraised? Months ago. Things don't come back from being appraised months ago." Then Etta did something that told me she'd been waiting for someone to do it for a long time. She dried her hands, went to the bottom of the pantry, and pulled out a paper grocery sack, folded over at the top. She set it on the counter and slid it toward me without a word. Inside were bank statements, overdraft notices, a second mortgage application, a pawnshop receipt for assorted sterling flatware. She had been quietly saving the mail he threw away, pulling it back out of the trash, for the better part of a year. "I didn't know who to give them to," Etta said. "You can't trust the family. They're all his." I went through the statements at the counter while the ice maker hummed. "I'm a cook, not an accountant. But you don't need a degree to read a column of numbers, walking steadily in one direction. Out, out, out. Month after month. Transfers and withdrawals. An old woman's savings draining into some place that wasn't her. The clock, the silver. An attempted line of credit against the house I'd grown up in." It went back years. I took out my phone and photographed every page the way you'd photograph a scene, because some part of me already knew that paper has a way of disappearing in that house, like clocks, like silver, like a photograph off a mantel. While I did it, Etta talked, low, finally letting out something she'd been carrying alone for a long time. He'd started small, she said. A check here, signed, for groceries. Then the good silver went to be cleaned and didn't come back. Then the brass clock. Then men in suits started coming to the house while Miss Opal was napping, and there were papers, and the phone got taken, and the calls to her old friends stopped. Etta had watched a sharp, funny woman get walled off inside her own home, one quiet theft at a time, and there had been nothing a housekeeper with no last name on anything could do about it but pull the mail back out of the trash and wait for the right person to come home. "I prayed somebody would come," Etta said. "I didn't think it'd be you, baby. No offense. I just didn't think they'd let you near it." "They didn't let me," I said. "She called me anyway." Etta nodded slowly, like that confirmed something she'd suspected about my grandmother for a long while, and went back to wiping a counter that didn't need it, which was what she did with her hands when the rest of her was somewhere heavier. I was still standing there with that when I heard my father's voice through the half-open door of the study. Sharp, the way I'd never heard him be in front of people. He was on the phone, and he didn't know I was in the house yet. "I told you. The house closes Monday. You'll get every cent." A pause. "Don't call here again." I stood very still in the hallway with a clean glass in one hand and a sack of his discarded mail in the other. And I listened to a man promise a stranger every cent from the sale of his mother's home. And I understood, all at once, in my stomach, before my head, that this had never been about her care. I went back to the bedroom. She'd given up on the cardigan and was just holding it in her lap. I sat down next to her and picked up the corner of it without thinking, and I felt how thin the wool had gotten, how many years she'd had it, and she said, almost too soft to hear, "I don't want to die somewhere that smells like bleach." I'd heard things on the phone for a year. Now I was sitting in the cold of it, holding the sweater she'd packed to be taken away in. No bleach. Not her. I decided it sitting on that bed, before I had any idea how. Etta found me in the hall a little later. She didn't say anything. She just handed me a folded napkin with a note tucked inside, in her careful hand. "Sit with your grandmother before they come. She wants to talk." So a man was selling his mother's house out from under her to pay off a debt. I was only beginning to understand, and the woman who'd raised me wanted to talk before the family arrived to put her away. I'd learned the full number that afternoon. $280,000 drained over years from his own mother. If you're feeling that heat climb up your chest right now, you're not the only one. So here's what I want you to do before I take you into that kitchen. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, sitting where I was sitting, an outsider with no standing and a sealed envelope you'd sworn not to open. Then stay and watch what actually happened. Because my grandmother had not called me home to watch. She'd called me home to finish something. She was at the kitchen table when I came in, and she was not folding anything. Her hands were flat and still on the wood, and the light through the cracked screen door fell across them. And for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked less like a woman being carried out of her life and more like a woman who'd been waiting a long time for a particular bus. "Sit," she said. I sat. "I'm not as frightened as I've let them think," my grandmother said. "I needed Garrett comfortable. Comfortable men get careless." She turned her hand over and took mine, and her grip was stronger than it had any business being. "I went to a lawyer 2 winters ago. A good one. Hollis Crane. I told everyone I had a hair appointment, and I went on a Tuesday, and I kept going on Tuesdays until it was done." I didn't say anything. I'd learned with her that when she was laying something down, you let her lay it down. "Your father has spent years moving my money into his own hands," she went on even, almost gentle, as if she were reading a recipe. "I let him think I didn't see it, an old woman who can't keep track. That's the part that hurt. You know, more than the money, that he was so sure I'd gone soft in the head." A small breath. "So I used it. I let him believe it, and while he believed it, I undid him. Quietly, the way he did it to me." I felt the floor tilt a little. "Undid him how?" "That envelope I sent you." She nodded at my bag, where it sat by the chair leg. "It's all in there. I had Hollis pull his power of attorney out from under him and put it in your hands instead, where he can't touch it and doesn't even know it's gone. The house isn't his to sell, and it isn't really mine anymore. Not the way he thinks. It's in a trust now, with your name on it." She paused, and her voice didn't shake, but mine would have. "And there's a letter from my doctor saying I'm in my right mind. Dated, signed, so that when they stand up and say I've lost it, the paper says otherwise." I thought of that one myself. A lawyer, a trust, my name, 2 winters of Tuesday hair appointments. She had been the one giving orders this whole time. The frightened woman folding a cardigan was a performance she'd been running so the man she was hunting would keep walking toward the trap. "Grandma," I said, "if you had all this months ago, you could have stopped him months ago. One phone call from Hollis. Why did you let it get this far? Why let them come at all?" And she looked at me with those clear, tired eyes. "Because stopping him in a quiet office doesn't undo 30 years, she said. I didn't just want to stop him, sweet girl. I wanted them to see you. All of them. In that room. I wanted it on the record, in front of every person who ever made you eat standing up. Exactly who this family belongs to. That's not something a letter can do. Her hand tightened on mine. He has to do it to himself. In front of them, and he will. Because he can't help it. Hollis told me to just file it, she said. Send Garrett a letter, freeze the accounts, be done. Sensible man, but sensible wasn't the point. She almost smiled. I told him I'd waited 30 years to watch this family find out what you're worth, and I could wait for the right afternoon. So when your father set his date and called them all home to bless it, I let him. I sent you the text, and I told Hollis to be ready to walk through that door when I sent for him. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and slid a folded sheet of paper across the table to me, the way I would, hours later, slide an envelope across a different table. It was a letter in her hand, and she told me to read it. I'm going to tell you what it said, because everything after this turns on it. I opened it slowly. The kitchen was quiet except for the gardenia smell coming weak through the door and the far-off ticking of the hall clock, and her handwriting wobbled in a way it never used to, and I read, Sadie, if you're reading this at my kitchen table, then they've made their move and you've come home, and I'm prouder of you than I've ever been able to say out loud in this house. You stayed when no one made you. You cooked for people who never set you a place. You loved me when there was nothing in it for you and no paper telling you that you had to. That is the only thing that has ever made anyone family. Not blood. Not a name. Staying. So I'm doing on paper what I should have made them do at the dinner table 30 years ago. I'm giving you what's mine, because you're mine. You always were. Let them argue with the ink. I set the letter down. My throat had closed somewhere, around the third line. For the first time in my adult life, I was not thinking about how to keep the peace. I folded her letter and put it in my bag, next to the envelope. And I waited. They came in the late afternoon. The way family comes for a thing they want to feel was solemn. Cars filled the drive. Aunts in good blouses. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. My father's sister directing where to set the casserole dishes like a woman who'd been promised something. The cold house warmed up with bodies and low talk, the particular hum of people who have already agreed on the ending and only need to perform the middle. I stayed near the wall and watched. Watching is a thing I'm good at. You learn it, eating standing up at the edge of a room for 30 years. I watched my great-aunt pat my grandmother's hand and say, loud enough to be heard, "Now, this is for the best, Opal. You'll be so much more comfortable." While my grandmother nodded along, small and vague, playing the part. I watched a cousin tell another cousin, behind a hand, that it was about time someone took the house in hand. I watched them rehearse their kindness like a hymn they all knew the words to. An uncle I barely recognized told me the shrimp I'd brought up from the kitchen looked almost professional and seemed to think it was a kindness. A cousin asked me, brightly, whether I was still doing the little restaurant thing, and didn't wait for the answer. Two of the aunts had their heads together by the window, and I caught my own name in the low current of it, and the words nerve and showing up. And then they saw me looking and smiled the smiles you give a waiter. None of it touched me the way it would have a year before. I had spent the afternoon reading the receipts of what this family had done to the one person in it who'd ever been kind to me, and somewhere between the china cabinet and the kitchen table, I had stopped needing their good opinion. So I just watched. I watched who deferred to my father and who avoided my grandmother's eyes and who had already, in their hearts, signed off on putting an old woman in a building with 2 bags. I learned that room the way I learn a kitchen on a first night, where the heat was, who was solid, where it was going to go wrong. Somewhere in that hour, I stopped rehearsing the little apologies I'd always kept ready in that house, the sorries I handed out for taking up space. I didn't have any left. I'd spent them all on people who never once said it back. My father, Garrett Faircloth, has a particular way of running a room. He'd inherited the family's respectability the way you inherit a watch, and he wore it the same way, out where everyone could see it. He moved through them, shaking hands, accepting the soft condolences of people who thought they were here to help a frail old woman into a better situation. He clapped a cousin on the back. "Good," he said. "Good. Everyone's here. We'll settle this today, as a family." And when he caught sight of me against the wall, his smile didn't drop so much as cool, like a stovetop turned off. "Sadie, a beat for the room. You came all this way. You can say goodbye to the house with the rest of us." A few of the aunts exchanged looks. The girl with no place, summoned to a funeral for a building. Wade found me by the wall before we sat. My father's son by blood. The real Faircloth. A man who had never once in our lives spoken to me as if I lived in the same house he did. He looked me over. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Wade said. "I came for Grandma," I said, and that was all. I had 30 years of practice not giving them more than that. "She's not your grandma," he said, almost bored, the way you'd correct a child about a word. "You get that, right? You never were anything here." I let it sit. I had something in my bag that was going to answer him better than I ever could, and a woman at the foot of the table who'd told me to wait, so I waited. They sat. My grandmother let them put her at the foot of the long table, and she let my father take the head, and she folded her hands and looked, to everyone but me, like the guest of honor at her own quiet undoing. As she passed me, she touched my arm, light as a moth, and murmured, so only I could hear, "Let them all sit, sweet girl. Bring your bag. Bring your bag." She knew exactly what was in it. She'd put it there. I took the chair at the side, the one she'd always saved for me, and I set my bag on the floor against my leg. The hall clock ticked through the open doorway. My father tapped his ring on the table to bring the room to order, and every face turned to him, the head of the family, about to settle things. They thought that afternoon was their ending. It was hers. He didn't waste time. He'd done this in his head 100 times. "We all love Mother," my father began, hand flat on the table, voice pitched for the room. "And loving her means being honest about what she needs now. She can't keep this house. It's too much for her, the stairs, the upkeep, all of it. So I've made arrangements. A good facility, the best in the county. The house closes Monday, and the proceeds go to her care. And Mother will be somewhere safe, where people can look after her properly." Murmurs. Nods, my great-aunt's chin, lifting in approval. A cousin said, softly, "It really is for the best." I watched my grandmother across the table keep her eyes down, hands folded, the picture of a woman things were happening to. I knew what she was doing. It still took everything I had to sit there and watch them talk about her like furniture being moved. "She doesn't want to go," I said. Quiet, even. My father's head turned toward me slowly, the way a door swings when there's weight behind it. "Sadie, this is being decided by the people responsible for her." "The people responsible for her," I said, "sold her mother's clock to a pawnshop." A ripple went through the table. My father's jaw tightened. My aunt said my name. A warning. Wade leaned forward. "Watch your mouth," he said. "I'm just asking who's been paying her bills," I said, and I felt 30 years of swallowed words pressing up behind my teeth, and I kept my voice flat anyway, because flat was the only weapon I'd brought to the table that anyone could see. Because I've seen the statements, and Monday isn't about her care. Monday is about a debt. The table didn't like that. I watched it, not like it. My great-aunt set down her fork. Sadie, that is an ugly thing to say about your father after everything this family has done for you. Everything this family has done for me, I repeated, and I heard my own voice stay level, and somewhere off the hall clock kept ticking. I cooked your Thanksgivings. I carried out your turkeys. I ate them standing up in that kitchen for 30 years. Forgive me if I've stopped being grateful for the leftovers. You're a guest here, Wade said. You've always been a guest. Guests don't go through people's mail. Then somebody who wasn't a guest should have, I said. My father raised his hand, the patriarch quieting a room, and the room quieted for him the way it always had. Mother isn't well, he said, slow, reasonable, performing it for everyone watching. She gets confused. She forgets things, signs things, says things she doesn't mean. That's the whole reason this is necessary. Someone has to protect her from herself. He let his eyes rest on me. And from people who'd take advantage of a confused old woman. I almost laughed. He was describing himself and pointing at me while he did it. That's a serious thing to say about her mind, I said. Are you sure you want it on the record that your mother doesn't know what she signs? Something crossed his face, there and gone. He didn't know yet why that question had teeth. I did. He softened, switched masks, spread his hands like a man being generous. Sadie, no one is saying you didn't care for her. You did in your way. But caring isn't the same as being responsible, and you walked away from this family a long time ago. You don't get to fly back in for one afternoon and tear up arrangements that grown, blood relatives have made. There's that word again, I said. What word? Blood? I looked around the table, at the aunts, at the cousins, at the empty space on the stair wall, in my mind, where I had never once appeared. It's the only one anybody in this house has ever needed. Not love, not staying. Blood. A cousin muttered that maybe this wasn't the time. My aunt said my name again, sharper, her hand flat on the tablecloth, like she could press me back down into the silence I'd lived in for 30 years. I looked down the table at my grandmother. She had her eyes on her folded hands. She had not said one word in her own defense this whole time, and every aunt at that table was reading her stillness as weakness, as proof, as a frail old woman letting the men sort it out. Only I knew what that stillness was. She was a hunter, holding her breath. She had told me he would have to do it to himself, in front of them, and she was giving him every inch of room he needed. She seems clear enough to me, I said. You haven't been here, my aunt snapped. You don't get to fly in once in years and decide what she is. You gave up any say the day you left. There it was, the other wall. Not yours, and you left. Stay and be the help. Leave and be the stranger. And never, in 30 years, a single inch of floor in between where I'd simply be allowed to belong. I had spent my whole life feeling along that wall for a door, and there had never been one, because the door was painted on. So I stopped feeling for it. You're right, I said, quiet. I left. I built a whole life somewhere. None of you would ever have to set me a place. And then she called me at 1 a.m. to tell me you were putting her away, and I got on a plane. I laid both hands flat on the table. So, I'm here now. And since we're settling things as a family, in front of everyone, I'll ask it plainly. Where did her mother's silver go? Where's the brass clock that stood in that cabinet my whole life? My father's face changed. Just slightly. A man who has heard a question he was not ready for and does not want answered in this room. This conversation is over, he said. Sadie, where's the clock, Dad? That's when it happened. The respectability cracked, and what was under it came out, and it came out loud. He stood up so fast his chair scraped back across the floor. He pointed at me down the length of the table, in front of every aunt and every cousin and his own mother. "You don't get a voice here. Get out." The room went silent. "You're not family. You never were. Your mother dragged you in and we tolerated you. Now you fly in and you think you get a say." He leaned on his knuckles. "There is no paper on this earth that makes you a faircloth. Get out of my house." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I put my hands flat on the table. They didn't shake. I looked at the man who had never once pulled out a chair for me, and I said nothing at all. Down at the foot of the table, my grandmother spoke. Her voice was small and clear, and it cut through everything. "Let her speak, Garrett." She didn't raise it. "She has something for you." I reached down into my bag. I pulled out the thick, sealed envelope I had carried 1,200 miles, the one I'd kept in a drawer for months and sworn not to open, and I slid it across the table to him. He looked at it like it was beneath him. He picked it up with 2 fingers. "What is this?" he said to the room, performing. "A sympathy card?" He tore it open. He read 1 line. The smirk died on the first line, and it did not come back. He told me I had no voice, so I let the paper speak for me. He read the top page standing up. It was a letter from Hollis Crane, attorney, short. The plain way, lawyers say the worst things. It said the durable power of attorney Garrett Faircloth had held over his mother's affairs had been revoked 2 winters earlier. It said the residence was held in trust. It said the trust's beneficiary was me. And it said a review of his handling of his mother's accounts had been completed and documented. "This is nonsense," he said, but his voice had gone thin. "I have power of attorney for my mother." "Not since 2 winters ago," said a voice from the doorway. Hollis Crane had let himself in, a spare gray man with a soft leather folder under his arm, the kind of calm that comes from having done a thing correctly and being unhurried about proving it. My grandmother had asked him to come, and he'd been waiting, I realized. The way she'd been waiting. The way the whole afternoon had been a room slowly filling with people who knew what was about to happen and people who didn't. He came to the table and opened his folder and began, without drama, to lay pages down in front of my father, one at a time, like a man dealing cards he was certain of. The revocation. Signed, dated, notarized. 2 winters ago, Hollis said, you have had no legal authority over your mother's affairs since. Garrett's hand was not steady now. You can't just... The trust deed. The home was placed in trust before you ever contacted a realtor, Hollis said. It is not yours to sell. There was never going to be a sale. The closing on Monday could not have happened. A title search would have ended it in an afternoon. A letter from a physician. Dated, clear. His mother of sound mind on every day these documents were signed. In case anyone in this room intended to suggest she was confused, Hollis said, and let it sit. Then he laid down the last set. And these he didn't have to narrate because the numbers did it themselves. The accounting, years of it, transfers, withdrawals, an attempted second mortgage, a pawnshop receipt for sterling flatware, the brass clock that had stood in that dining room since before any of us were born. $280,000 walked out of an old woman's accounts and into her son's. The room turned to him, not to me, to him. I watched my great-aunt's hand come off my grandmother's arm. I watched a cousin slide his chair back an inch, the way you do from something you don't want on you. The hymn they'd all been singing stopped mid-word. Garrett looked up and found the faces he'd summoned to back him, and not one of them would meet his eyes. She's confused, he said to the room now, not to me. She doesn't understand what she signed. Any judge would see that. The physician's letter is right there, Hollis said, mild, tapping it once with 2 fingers. Signed the same day. You're welcome to take it to a judge. My father turned to his sister. Tell them Tell them Mother isn't right in the head. And my aunt, who had spent the whole afternoon nodding at everything he said, looked down at the pawnshop slip on the table, at the words assorted sterling flatware in somebody's careless hand. She had polished that silver. She had laid it out on the good cloth at every Christmas of my childhood and counted it back into its felt afterward, and she knew the weight of every piece, and she knew it was gone. She put her hand over her mouth, and she did not tell them anything. He looked at Wade. Wade looked at the floor. Wade, who'd told me an hour earlier that I was a guest, that I'd never been anything here, found the carpet very interesting. I had spent 30 years in that room as the one everyone turned from. I watched the whole table turn from him instead. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't look away from it either. My grandmother folded her hands on the table. "There's a will, too," she said into the silence. "Read the last page, Garrett." He read the last page. It left everything to me. The house, what remained of the rest. And it named me her heir and the executor of her estate, the girl with no last name, in ink, witnessed and notarized 2 winters back. His knees gave out. He caught the back of his chair on the way down and stayed there, half standing, half folded, gripping the wood. The page slipped out of his fingers onto the table. The room said nothing. I stood up. I'd called him my father my whole life. I didn't after that. I looked down at the man clutching the chair, and I used his name like the stranger he just made himself. "You don't get to decide whose family, Garrett," I said. She already did. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out but my grandmother's name. Twice, like a question with no one left to answer it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The papers were doing all the shouting. "Here's what happens now," I said. "We won't take this to a court, and we won't file the elder abuse report Mr. Crane has already drawn up. If you sign what he puts in front of you, you return what you can, and you go. That's the only kindness anyone in this room is offering you today, and it's more than you offered her." I slid a pen across the table to him, the way I'd slid the envelope. He signed. He didn't look up while he did it, and the aunts who'd come in their good blouses to watch a frail old woman be carried off sat there and watched a man sign away the house he'd tried to steal in front of all of them, exactly the way she'd planned it. Hollis gathered the signed pages back into his folder without a word. Across the table, my grandmother let out a breath I think she'd been holding for 2 winters, and reached over and squeezed my hand once, under the eyes of every person who had ever pretended she wasn't there. If you've ever been the one a family decided didn't count, you already know it was never the money. It was never even the house. It was the not being seen, the standing up to eat, the clean rectangle on the wall where you should have been. So before I tell you how it ended, I want you to tell me something. Have you found your grandma yet? The one person who chose you when no document on earth said they had to? Tell me about them in the comments. I'll be reading. He told me to get out of his house. He left instead. The gardenia came back first. I stayed in Savannah longer than I'd planned. The sale died on its own the moment a title company looked at it, because the house had never been my father's to sell. Hollis said it the way he said everything. Mild, final. Everything she built holds. It always would have. Garrett left town within the month, ahead of questions he didn't want asked. Wade stopped calling. A couple of the aunts sent careful sideways notes that weren't quite apologies and weren't quite anything. The family that had spent 30 years counting me out of the table quietly came apart over the man who'd done the counting. I won't pretend that was a happy thing to watch. It wasn't, but it was an honest thing finally, after a lifetime of the other kind. I didn't go back to 22 seats right away. I stayed and I cooked in that kitchen, and I sat with my grandmother in the evenings while the gardenia by the door, watered now, gave its brown edges up for new green. The way a thing does when somebody finally notices. One evening, she handed me her letter again and asked me to read it out loud to her. I got 2 lines in and my voice quit on me. Etta, drying a dish at the sink, finished the sentence so I wouldn't have to. There was one more line in it I hadn't read the first time, at the kitchen table, because I'd had to stop. I read it that night, slowly, with the screen door cracked and the smell of the gardenia coming back into the room after all those years. And tell your mother, when you talk to her the way I know you do, that Maribel belonged in this house too. They took her picture off the wall, put it back. She was the start of the best thing that ever came through that door, which was you. I put my mother's photograph back on the mantel in the clean rectangle that had waited there all that time. The hall clock was still ticking when I sat down beside my grandmother that last quiet evening, the same as it had ticked through every dinner I ever ate, standing up. She listened to it a while, and then she smiled at me, the old correcting a clerical error smile. "Told you," she said, "keeps better time than he does." Blood didn't make me hers. She did, and that was always enough.